please can I welcome to the stage and get you to welcome her too, Fiona Patten, who was a member of the Victorian Parliament's Legislative Council for 8 years, leaving Parliament following the state election last year, and of course was, during her time in Parliament, a champion for many secular reforms, including, of course, voluntary assisted dying, now legal in every state in Australia. We can feel beleaguered sometimes on this side of the argument, but we are winning a lot of things at the moment, and we don't celebrate our wins often enough. Please welcome Fiona. She's got a special part of my heart because I did run for her party for the Senate last year. Somewhat unsuccessfully, but I had a good time doing it.
And it's an absolute travesty that Jane Caro isn't in our Senate now. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I'd like to thank the seculars, the rationalists, the humanists, and the Teachers' Federation for supporting this really important conversation that we're all having. I too would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and remember that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So, oddly, this building, I have a bit of history with this building, and it's the history that probably brought me to this room today, and it's sex. I mean, I have not had sex in this building. I'd just like to acknowledge, I know that we all came here through sex, but something that is often denied by some of our religious folk, but or they would like to pretend that didn't happen. But this building on the third and fourth floor used to be the Office of Film, Literature and Classification. So this was the censorship office. So I would have many debates in here, and a lot of the censorship that we face today is around sex. So when the Catholic bishops were like, we got to ban porn, they were silent on violence. In fact, they had no problem with the violence. And I just think to this, there was this one time as I walked past, because we used to go in through Mary Street, and I walked past and the porn version of Caribbean, Pirates of the Caribbean came to mind. It's not the day really for Pirates of the Caribbean, it's a cloudy day, but it was called Stagnetti's Revenge, and it had been banned by the censor. Not because there was any violent sex in it, not because there was any derogatory behaviour in it. It was because it was the first porn film with computer-generated imagery, and it showed ghosts having a sword fight. And that had to be cut out. There was also some sword fights by actual pirates. Well, they were actually porn stars, but actual pirates. So all of the fighting had to be cut out of this film. So you would just see people bursting into a door, all sweaty, and people, thank God you're here. But you'd have no idea why they were sweaty. So you had to cut all of this out. And anyway, I know it's an aside, but it's certainly sex and censorship, and the censorship of sex, and the continuing fights around decriminalising and regulating sex work were two of the main areas that kind of got me here and got me back today. So does bring back a lot of memories. And Senator Harradine sadly is no longer with us. Sad, not sad. And the Reverend Fred Nile has remarkably retired. I think many of us never thought that was actually going to happen. But when I was lobbying for the adult industry, I would regularly hear the wrath of the church and the threat of the wrath of the church as the reasons why politicians would not support reform. I would often hear, when I was presenting logical arguments around whatever the issue was, Fiona, totally agree with you, but I hold this seat by 4%. There's a church down the road. If I piss them off, they may campaign against me and I will lose this seat. There was one time when I was speaking to one fellow, and he said, "Look, let's go and sit out on the back deck at the Victorian Parliament." And I was like, "Oh, all right then, that's nice." And he said, "I want to show you something." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Anyway, we went out to the back deck, and I was talking to him around censorship issues, and he said, "Look at that." And I'm looking around, thinking, "What?" And he said, "That." And he showed me the spire of St Patrick's Cathedral. And he said, "That's where I take my advice. Thank you very much." And walked away. And I was sort of sitting on the back deck thinking, right, okay. So, but I think, I've noticed it, and I'm sure David would have noticed this as well. That has changed. And we are seeing less and less of that really traditional sort of heavy-handed tactics. And I think, the power of that church in politics has diminished. And I think that's something that everyone in this room can take some credit for. And certainly for the humanists and the rationalists and the secularists before you who were here, who have been fighting this. When I was first sworn into Parliament, about half of us took an oath, an affirmation, rather than a religious oath. I think right now our parliaments probably reflect our census. It was certainly in the Victorian Parliament. Then you see the sort of the anomalies like Scott Morrison. I won't talk too much about him, but certainly you do see that. So when I was first sworn in, half my colleagues took an affirmation, but then we still had prayers in Parliament. We still had people like Alex Hawke and Scott Morrison still having regular prayer meetings in the federal Parliament. But I just thought I would reflect on some of those successes that we've had over the past years, and the fact that I have seen that very particularly conservative religious voice and the power of it diminish. And I think the first one would be safe access zones around abortion clinics. Now, this was, women would have to, and many of you will know this, and I know many of you have fought on this as well, would have to run the gauntlet of people chastising them, harassing them, threatening them, showing them horrendous photos and trying to talk them out of obtaining a health procedure, breaching their privacy, taking photos of them, grabbing them, telling that, calling them murderers, all of this. So we sensibly said, look, you can do that. Knock yourselves out, but you've got to do it 150 metres away from the clinic. Howls of breach of their religious rights and their religious freedoms, because they weren't harassing, they were praying, and they were counselling, and they were calling them murderers, and they were grabbing them, and they were trying to, one woman was telling me she took her child with her because she was actually not going there for an abortion, she was going for another procedure, and they were saying, "Did you know your mummy's a murderer?" Anyway, we were successful in that, and we got a very, it was a conscience vote in our Victorian Parliament, but it successfully and overwhelmingly was supported. And that safe access zones legislation has now been introduced in every state in Australia, New Zealand, and most recently Scotland. When it was, And we still have the anti-abortionists every Tuesday morning stand outside Parliament and protest about the abortions going on in Victoria. And I generally congratulate them. Good on you. I, support your right to have a belief. I just don't support you to have an audience for that belief. But they stand at the back of Parliament every time. And I think, for some of us, and certainly it's very new in New South Wales, voluntary assisted dying has just become legal just in the in the previous days, and that has just been a terrific thing. And I don't think any of us ever thought that we would see assisted dying legislation be legal in every state in Australia within 5 years. None of us thought that. But while we were having that first debate in Victoria, certainly there was a lot of men in black dresses walking around the parliament. But even then, they really, when as part of their lobbying, they would bring in priests and ministers from multicultural backgrounds. And they would argue that it was the multicultural aspect that was going to be so offensive around allowing people to die with dignity, that it would be the multicultural community that would, of course, leave, vote away from assisted dying en masse. But it was probably the Australian Christian lobby that was probably, the real campaigners in the parliament. Although I'd have to say that they brought their B team for voluntary assisted dying. And it was quite strange. So we never saw Lyle Shelton. He was the director at the time. I know. Look, I'm not sad about it. I'd probably agree. But no, he was too busy with the marriage equality plebiscite. So he kind of missed voluntary assisted dying and got quite a shock when he realised that we were actually debating it and it was actually probably going to pass. But even then, like when you looked at the vote for assisted dying in Victoria, and I can't say the same for the other states, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the day, but the vote actually ran on largely political lines. So in actual fact, the Liberal Party, only 10 members of the Liberal Party supported voluntary assisted dying, and only 10 members of the Labor Party opposed it. Now, some of them did have religious reasons for doing it, but I tell you, most of those who opposed it did not have religious reasons for doing so. They thought that if they could oppose it, it would have been a loss for the Premier, Daniel Andrews, at the time. They were unsuccessful. We saw the same thing with sex work. Again, sex work is certainly been one that religious organisations have tried to abolish, have tried to prohibit further and further to abolish it. We've just decriminalised sex work in Victoria. Obviously, I conducted that inquiry and led that investigation. But it was funny when I was thinking about it, and really the only opposition to it was, again, the Australian Christian lobby. Most of the other religious organisations were quite silent on it. And I remember back in 1992 when we were campaigning for sex work law reform in the ACT, the Catholic Archbishop Pat Power, came out in support. He said, I think it should be decriminalised. And, he left the church for many reasons, but mainly disappointment at where the church was going. So we saw this success, and as I say, we're seeing this, I think, a diminishment in the power of those religious organisations in our parliaments today. The compulsory reporting of child sexual abuse. This was around mandating that if a priest or a minister of the church was heard about child sexual abuse, they must report it. Now, you would have thought that there would have been no opposition to that. I mean, seriously. That they would say, no, we shouldn't have to report someone who is sexually abusing children. I mean, like, for fuck's sake. But yes, they did. And in fact, the Archbishop Comensoli said, well, I'll be breaking the law if someone admits to abusing a child in the confession. I ain't telling. Anyway, the Parliament didn't agree with him and it passed widely. We're starting to see the rollback in those extraordinary exemptions that religious organisations have in discrimination. They haven't rolled back far enough, obviously, but we have seen a number of those rollbacks. We've seen in those rollbacks, we've seen a lot of religious organisations fully support them, saying, why should I insist that my gardener is not gay? Why should I insist that the cleaner at the school it can't be a single parent? This is preposterous. And now they have to show reason. So we are moving back. But, we still have the likes of, we've still seen a lot of that religious privilege going on. So even on sex work, while we decriminalise sex work absolutely everywhere, street sex work, everything, except in front of a church during business hours. You can't solicit sex outside a church. Now, look, you also can't outside a school, and I think that that's quite sensible. And the only time I have seen sex work being solicited outside a school is actually on Forbes Street. And it's outside the Sydney Girls Grammar. I used to live on Liverpool Street on the corner of Forbes and Liverpool, and I would speak to some of the workers there, and they said, oh, look, 8 a.m. is actually a very busy time for us, when some of the fathers are dropping their children off at school. But we have a long way to go still. And I think David was reflecting on the prayers in Parliament. I know we're going to hear about the successes that we've had in removing prayers, certainly at a local council level. I pushed to have the prayer in our Parliament removed. We did manage a slight win. So unlike David's experience, we've insisted that they have the prayer first, then the acknowledgement of country. So we can stand outside like naughty little schoolgirls outside and then we can come in for the acknowledgement rather than the awkwardness of being there for the acknowledgement and walking out. However, the government did agree that they would change this. And so they did agree they'd do it this year. And last week was the last week of Parliament and they still haven't done it. But I do expect we will see change in Victoria, and then like assisted dying, like safe access zones, I expect that will continue to go around the rest of the country. In fact, the first vote in Victorian Parliament was whether we should have a prayer. In 1851, they were setting up the Parliament. They were discussing, having a prayer in Parliament. As we know from the census, there was not probably a single person who was not religious in that chamber on that day. But they could not agree. And in fact, the first division and the first vote in the Victorian Legislative Council was whether the council should start with a prayer. And it lost. So we didn't have a prayer in the Parliament for about the first 40 years of that Parliament. It was then introduced, and it has, and so this talk of tradition and all the rest is not true. I know I haven't got a lot of time. I wanted to get rid of blasphemy laws. I don't know if people realise we still have blasphemy laws in Australia. It seems remarkable. That we wouldn't just get rid of them as well. I put up a bill to get rid of the Victorian blasphemy laws. The government we never got around to debating it, but I had hoped that the government would do it in their next sort of clean-up of their Crimes Act, because that's where it sits. It is archaic. We got it from the UK and they abolished it. So the United Nations recommended we abolish it. Philip Ruddock recommended we abolish it. And yet it still remains on our in our Crimes Acts. The one thing I did want to talk about, which I think is so important before I finish, is corporate conscientious objection. So while we are seeing voluntary assisted dying reforms throughout the country, while we have seen abortion reforms throughout the country, we are still stuck with corporate conscientious objection. And this goes to some of the points that David was making about the government funding of religious organisations. So if you are a public hospital, but you are a religious public hospital, you can refuse abortions, you can refuse contraception, you can refuse assisted dying, and this extends out to palliative care organisations. This extends certainly to the hospitals, and we have places in Victoria where you are zoned to go to a religious hospital if you are pregnant, and if you have a cesarean, you cannot not get a tubal ligation. It's like putting aside abortion, just the other common sense things. Now, I lost that debate, and I lost it resoundingly in Parliament last year. That needs to change. So in my thoughts, like I'm an atheist as well. I kind of like a to-do list rather than a vision, and I think Because for me, secularism just equals equality. And it's as simple and as basic as that. It's that freedom to express yourself, whether you have a religious belief or not, and freedom to equality and freedom of conscience. So to me, certainly getting rid of the morning prayer in our parliaments has to be up there, because it sends such a perverse message to those of us who are not from a Christian faith. And that, I think, will have a really overwhelming impact on things. I think it's so important. But I think removing the attribute of advancement of religion as, within our Charities Acts will also bring round equality around discrimination, removing the exemptions that religious organisations have in our Discrimination Acts, and removing the tax concessions for commercial entities at least. I got the Parliamentary Budget Office to look at that. Just even charging land tax for those organisations that are commercial. So for the restaurants, for the mobile phone towers, for the tennis courts, for the office buildings that these religious organisations own, if they could just pay a bit of land tax on those. That was obviously, we have not been successful on this, but it does need to change. We need to have a fairer system, because that's what secularism means to me. It means equality. I do think that the census shows us that we are winning. And in some ways, I feel like we've won the war, on this. We just haven't won the battle and the battles, and we have so many more battles to go. So I'm so looking forward to the rest of the day and hearing from everyone and having the terrific conversations I know that we'll have. Thank you.